Good afternoon and good morning to those on the West Coast. I'm Amy Bloom, Director of the Miami section of the National Council of Jewish Women. I'm thrilled to open this webinar and to officially welcome you to today's discussion. LEAD, Organizing Skills for Grassroots Advocates, is a monthly webinar series designed to provide organizing and advocacy skills. This summer, NCJW will host a special three-part series of LEAD focusing on the intersection of abortion and other critical issues. We are incredibly grateful to Jessica Pinckney, Vice President of Government Affairs at In Our Own Voice, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda, who has joined us for part 2 to discuss abortion and voter suppression. For those who may be unfamiliar, the National Council of Jewish Women is a grassroots organization of over 90,000 volunteers, advocates, and supporters who turn progressive ideals into action. Inspired by Jewish values, NCJW strives for social justice by improving the quality of life for women, children, and families, and by safeguarding individual rights and freedoms. We've worked to make our vision of a world where these groups are fully valued and supported a reality across the United States through a powerful combination of education, advocacy, community organizing, and direct service. Since our founding in 1893, NCJW has supported access to family planning and reproductive health. NCJW was an early advocate for safe and legal abortion rights and access, and we continue this important work today at the local, state, and national levels through our 60 sections and action teams and network of state policy advocates. For over 125 years, NCJW has also worked to promote voting rights and to support policies that ensure easy and equitable access to the ballot box. We believe that our vote is our voice and that our democracy is at its strongest when every voice is heard. This work does not happen in silos. These issues are integrally connected, and our advocacy efforts are stronger when we highlight the intersectionality of our work. For instance, we know that racist gerrymandering and voter suppression tactics lead to the enactment of restrictive state abortion laws. Case in point, when speaking about passage of Georgia's 6-week ban and personhood law, former candidate for governor Stacey Abrams made a direct connection between reproductive rights and civil rights. The law is not only radical, she said, it also carries no more legitimacy than the election that gave Governor Brian Kemp the authority to sign it. This is a perfect example of what the consequences of not having free and fair elections can have, she said. We are excited to learn more about the connection between these issues and to hear from Jessica. In Our Own Voice, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda is a national organization initiative designed to amplify and lift up the voices of Black women at the national and regional levels in the ongoing fight to secure reproductive justice for all women and girls. In her role as Vice President of Government Affairs, Jessica is responsible for coordinating the development, implementation, and evaluation of the organization's national and state policy work. She previously served as Government Relations Manager for YWCA USA. Jessica holds a MA in Government with a concentration in Political Communications from Johns Hopkins University and a BA in Political Science with an emphasis in Public Service from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Following Jessica's presentation, we will discuss how you can take action by linking your reproductive health, rights, and justice efforts with your voter engagement work. We will then move to a Q&A. Please use the chat box to submit your questions. Shannon will moderate these questions and will be sure to repeat these instructions later. Let's get started.
Hi, everyone. Let me make sure I can still share my screen. Can you see? Great. Okay. So as was mentioned, I'm Jessica Pinckney. I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs at In Our Own Voice. Thank you so much. You did my little debrief on our organization for me, so save me a little bit. as was mentioned, our goal is to lift up the voices of Black women and girls at the local, state, and national level. And I just wanted to lift up our partner organizations by name, in case you happen to be in one of the states where we have a state partner organization. So In Our Own Voice is a national state partnership with Black Women for Wellness in California, Black Women's Health Imperative that also does national level work, New Voices for Reproductive Justice in Pennsylvania and Ohio, Sister Love in Georgia, Sister Reach in Tennessee, Spark Reproductive Justice Now in Georgia, the AFIA Center in Texas, and Women with a Vision in Louisiana. These are all organizations that are led by Black women and center Black women, girls, and femmes in their work. And we all work with a reproductive justice framework. So just a quick overview of what reproductive justice is, as I know it can sometimes be confused or conflated with reproductive health and rights. But essentially, reproductive justice is the human right to control our bodies, our sexuality, our gender, our work, and our reproduction. And that right can only be achieved when all women and girls have the complete economic, social, and political power and resources to make healthy decisions about our bodies, our families, and our communities in all areas of our lives. And something I really like to lift up is reproductive justice is a very holistic approach at looking at the world and the lived experiences, particularly of the most marginalized communities. So while we do talk about reproductive health and rights and our ability to choose if, when, and how we parent, we also talk about intersecting issues that impact our ability to make those decisions. That can include anything from housing to economic justice to immigrant justice, racial justice, gender justice, so on and so forth. And something we're really focused on working on right now is voting rights and addressing the serious voter suppression issues that disproportionately impact communities of color, LGBTQ folks, folks living in rural areas, so on and so forth. And so I think the intersection of the issues we're discussing today around abortion and voter suppression are really key to the reproductive justice framework. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about specific abortion restrictions, because I think we see a lot in the news and we hear a lot of discussions around the ways in which abortion is being restricted in the states. But it's much more, it varies by state, and it can be much more nuanced than some may realize. And so I wanted to go through some of the abortion restrictions and just kind of give an overview. The first type of restriction that we often hear a lot of conversation about is physician and hospital requirements, which is when states require an abortion to be performed by a licensed physician. This is currently the case in 41 states. Also, hospital requirements. Some states will require that an abortion after a specified point in pregnancy be performed in a hospital. There are about 19 states that have a requirement like that. I think the most common and certainly the type of abortion restrictions that have gotten a lot of attention over the last few months is around gestational limits. So this is when states prohibit abortions, generally except when necessary for the health or life of the pregnant person after a specified point in pregnancy. So gestational bans include a 6-week ban, a 20-week ban, so on and so forth. There are 43 states right now that have some type of gestational limit. on abortions performed in their state. And I'll flag it now, and I can share a link later, but Guttmacher actually has a chart that shows state by state which of these abortion restrictions are applied in the state. So you can see which ones are the most egregious, which we're going to get into in a little bit. Another type of abortion restriction is a partial birth abortion ban, which is when states have laws in effect that prohibit partial birth abortion. So partial birth abortion, the definition can vary a little bit depending on who's using the term, but it's usually after the first trimester. Public funding is a type of abortion restriction that is also getting a lot of attention right now because of some presidential candidates who have lifted it up in their agendas and remarks. Some of you may be familiar with the Hyde Amendment, which essentially says that Medicaid cannot be used by the states to pay for abortions. There are right now 16 states that will use their own funds separate from the federal funds that are provided to pay for all or most medically necessary abortions for Medicaid enrollees in their state. And then there are about 30 plus states and the District of Columbia, which prohibit the use even of state Medicaid funds, except in the cases when federal funds might be available, which is for the life and health of the pregnant person. And so we see this type of abortion restriction really impacting, again, low-income folks of color, LGBTQ folks, young folks who are trying to access abortion care and are on Medicaid. A few other types of restrictions include coverage by private insurance. So there are some states that restrict their private insurance plans from covering abortion care. But most often there's some kind of limiting of the coverage for only when the pregnant person's life is endangered. But most states will allow the purchase of additional abortion coverage at an additional cost. So you will see a lot of times in the news abortion bans, abortion restrictions, and abortion coverage writ large being talked about as it relates to the Affordable Care Act and other changes to our healthcare system that are often discussed with lawmakers. And then we have refusals. There are about 45 states currently that allow individual healthcare providers to refuse to participate in providing abortion care. And because of that, we see what some folks call abortion deserts, where there are very few, if any, providers who are providing abortion care. So even if some of these other abortion restrictions don't already exist in the state, it's really not a right that folks can access or a type of care that folks can access if there are no providers providing that service in their state or in close distance to wherever they are. Another type of abortion restriction we see discussed a lot is state-mandated counseling. About 20 states mandate that pregnant folks must be given counseling before an abortion, and it has to include specific information, usually that's not based on evidence. So that includes making a link between abortion and breast cancer. I think there are about 5 or 6 states that have that included in their resources. About 15 states have in their resources that a reminder, quote unquote, to those seeking abortion care that there's a possibility of the fetus being able to feel pain. And then about 10 states require that their counseling materials include information about potential long-term mental health consequences for folks who receive abortion care. Again, I want to reiterate, none of this is based on evidence, and state-mandated counseling is considered to be incredibly coercive to pregnant individuals trying to access abortion care. But as I just mentioned, there are quite a few number of states that will require this type of counseling. And then I wanted to lift up waiting periods. About half of states require a person seeking abortion care to wait a specified period of time, usually about 24 hours between when they receive their counseling and when the procedure is performed. And this can require, in a lot of instances, folks to make 2 separate trips to a clinic. Again, we've talked about how it can already be hard to acquire care due to there not being enough providers, there not being providers in close distance. And so these waiting periods can really impose an additional barrier on individuals seeking abortion care. And then lastly, parental involvement. About 40 states require some type of parental involvement in a minor's decision to have an abortion. And about 25 states require that one or both parents consent to the procedure. And so this can, again, be an additional burden, particularly for folks who have unique family structures, who don't have relationships with their parents, who have to go through a judicial bypass process in a lot of states to access the care you need. And so the reason I wanted to walk through all these, and I think it's really important to understand that it's not just gestational bans, but a lot of different barriers that impact folks' ability to access care, is these are often compounding. And so based on how I described them, you'll see that many of these states have multiple bans, multiple restrictions in place. And so it's just hurdle after hurdle that an individual may have to overcome to access the care that they want and need. And none of these restrictions are centering the lived experiences of individuals or their bodily autonomy. So I did just want to lift up a little bit about what abortions restrictions in the states has looked like recently. We've certainly seen an influx. There were 59 restrictions enacted in 2019 alone. And between 2011 and 2015, the data is a little bit out of date, but 288 abortion restrictions were enacted in that 4-year time period. So we've seen real restricting of our rights over the last decade or so. As I was talking about before, in terms of where folks are able to access abortion care, about 57% of women in childbearing age live in a state that's hostile to abortion rights, and only about 40% live in a state that's supportive of abortion rights. So more than half of women, and that doesn't include folks who don't identify as women who may need abortion care, are living somewhere where they cannot easily access that care. And then on the right side of the slide, you'll see some great data and statistics from, again, the Guttmacher Institute that kind of gives an overview of what the traditional abortion patient might look like. 75% are poor or low income. 62% identify with some type of religion. 59% already have a child. You'll see a quarter of all abortion patients are identify as Hispanic, and a little bit over a quarter identify as Black. And this doesn't even get into the statistics around LGBTQ folks. It gets into a little bit around young folks, but you'll see everyone of all ages, of various different lived experiences are trying to access abortion care. So this is an issue that really does impact us all in every state, wherever we live. And just to reiterate, the 59 abortion restrictions that were enacted in 2019 were enacted by state legislators. And so I think that's something really important to keep in mind as we get to the voter suppression aspect of this conversation. I just wanted to lift up where some of the most restrictive states are for abortion. I don't think that a lot of these will come as a surprise based on the news that we've seen over the past few months and years. The most restrictive abortion law in the country is in Alabama. The ban makes abortion illegal in virtually all cases, including cases of rape and incest. And doctors who perform abortions could face serious consequences, including life in prison. This is the abortion law that was enacted earlier this spring. And there are many organizations and folks considering lawsuits. And so we will probably see more discussion, particularly of this ban. But lawmakers in Georgia, Ohio, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Missouri also proposed so-called heartbeat bills this year, which essentially mean abortion is illegal once a heartbeat is detectable. And all of those were successfully signed into law. Again, those bills generally ban abortions after a fetal heartbeat is detected, which can be as early as 6 weeks into a pregnancy, which is when most folks don't even know that they're pregnant. So essentially, this is a ban on abortion entirely, because if you don't know that you're pregnant, then you don't know that you need to access this type of care before it becomes illegal. And then I wanted to lift up some other states where abortion restrictions are under consideration or have been under consideration and have not passed. There's a growing list of states that are seeking to limit abortion rights, and at least 10 of them listed here proposed legislation that specifically mentioned heartbeat detection. So some of the proposed bills in Florida, Louisiana, Illinois, New York, South Carolina, Texas, Tennessee, are still making their way through the legislative process. While others, thankfully, like the ones in Maryland and Minnesota, failed to gain traction. But I think, we'll continue to see a rise in these types of abortion restrictions. As you can see, it's not necessarily just centered in the South, as folks like to often think. This is, again, an issue that can impact individuals just about anywhere. We do have some states that are supportive of abortion, as was referenced in that previous statistic. About 45% of women are living in a state that is friendly towards abortion care. We've seen some really great policies come out of Oregon, New York, that really give folks the bodily autonomy they deserve to make these types of decisions. And hopefully we'll see more states take up that mantle instead. Voter suppression. There is a direct link to these issues, and I'm going to make it now. Voter suppression is really any effort, legal or illegal. I think that's a really important thing to lift up. Voter suppression is done legally, quote unquote, a lot of the time, but it doesn't mean that we're not suppressing folks' ability to vote. So voter suppression is any effort, legal or illegal, that prevents eligible voters from registering to vote or voting. And we have seen, as we've seen an uptick of abortion restrictions, we've also seen an uptick of voting laws and that are restrictive, as well as tactics that really suppress people's abilities to vote and access the poll. So, sorry. This is just a quick list of what some of the voter suppression tactics look like. Again, many of these are legal, passed into law by states, but it doesn't mean that it isn't impeding folks' abilities to go to the poll and make their voice and views known. Voter ID laws really claim that anyone can easily access an ID. Many states do offer them for free. However, free IDs have hidden costs. In most cases, they're not necessarily the easiest to get. Not everyone has a car. Not everyone lives close to a location where you can get an ID. Not everyone has the money or the time to take off work to get to a location where you can get an ID. And not everyone has the money to pay for the documents you might need. So while it seems very simple to acquire an ID, it's not always that case. Voter roll purging is something that some states like Kansas have been doing, where they essentially compare the voter roll data from state to state and remove duplicate entries to quote unquote clean up the voter rolls. But studies have been done that show that can produce a lot of false positives. Folks in two different states could have the same names, and therefore someone ends up getting purged from the poll, but from the roll, but really they weren't voting illegally. So oftentimes what this leads to is voters showing up to the poll only to find out that they've been purged, and usually then it's too late to register to vote in most cases. And then another type of voter roll purging that occurs is use it or lose it, which is commonly related to places like Ohio and Georgia, which we saw this last election, where you're purged from the polls if you don't vote after a specific period of time. So say you vote in 2018, and for whatever reason you skip the 2020 election, you may go back in 2022 and discover that you're no longer on the polls, and you wouldn't necessarily know this until you arrived, and again, it's too late to register. We also see limits to early voting, and this is when early voting really gives voters who may not be able to get the time off from work necessary, whether it be because of work or family obligations or whatever the case may be. And what we've seen over the last few years is states implementing no excuse early voting systems, where you would traditionally see higher turnout. And just generally a cutting of the locations where folks can go to do early voting, which can mean really long lines on election day, which just sometimes pushes folks out of being able to, go on their lunch break or go when is convenient for them. With gerrymandering, I really think that this is one of the greatest threats to our democracy, because it's denying legitimate representation in government by drawing electoral districts in order to favor one party. And so there's a lot of work that's done in voting rights spaces to ensure that when we're doing redistricting, as it relates to the census, that we're ensuring that it's nonpartisan commissions who are doing the redistricting. And then we have both felony and transgender disenfranchisement. With felony disenfranchisement, in every state but 2, voters are automatically unable to vote if they're convicted of a felony. The concept of prison is that a person serves their time and then their debt is paid to society. But when we don't allow folks who have been convicted of a felony to vote after their sentence, then we're essentially extending that sentence. And they're basically being told that they don't have the same rights as other folks. So we saw a lot of work done around felony disenfranchisement in Florida this past election. Very exciting to see a ballot initiative around that. As it relates to transgender disenfranchisement, this gets back to some of the voter ID issues. A lot of folks may not have IDs that match their gender identity or physical presentation, and it really shouldn't impact your ability to cast your ballot. But we've seen increasingly strict voter ID laws that really create barriers for trans folks who may have difficulty obtaining an ID in the first place, or because once they get to the poll, they're turned away based on misunderstanding of the law or bias that may exist based on those working at the polls. And then I think, similar to what we see with abortion restrictions, there's a lot of disinformation that gets passed around as it relates to voting. Voters receive oftentimes official-looking mailers that has incorrect information, and this can just lead folks to make errors in registering to vote and showing up at the polls and making informed decisions. And then we're also seeing, in addition to closing of early voting stations, a lot of ID offices closing. And that only increases the challenges to obtaining a ID if you have to go online, if you don't have access to internet or a computer, or are not comfortable using a computer. These may be barriers that impact you from accessing a ID. So in terms of voter restrictions in the states, it's even broader, I would say, than abortion restrictions. So since the 2010 election, we've seen state lawmakers introduce hundreds of really harsh measures to make it harder for folks to vote. And the new laws can range anywhere from strict photo ID requirements to early voting cutbacks, so on and so forth. Overall, 25 states have put in place new restrictions since 2010. 15 states have more restrictive voter ID laws. 12 have laws making it harder for citizens to register. 10 make it more difficult to vote early or by absentee ballot. And some even took action to make it harder to restore voting rights for those with past convictions. This is a map from the Brennan Center for Justice. They have a great interactive map on their website where you can click on your state and see which voter restrictions have been enacted in your state specifically, so you can understand that and share that resource and knowledge with others as you're taking action. So how do abortion bans and voter suppression intersect? Legislatures in Alabama, Georgia, Ohio, Missouri have passed some of the harshest abortion restrictions, as we looked at before. But aside from their really clear assault on reproductive freedom, on bodily autonomy, these states also have really enacted systemic efforts to distort the democratic process through voter suppression and gerrymandering. These tactics have really allowed near total bans on abortion and other really extreme policies to be easily enacted in these states. The one example I want to lift up is Georgia, which was referenced in the opening remarks. The governor's race last year became the epicenter of voter suppression efforts. Secretary of State Brian Kemp oversaw his own election and instituted a series of policies that hurt his opponent. Secretary Kemp purged over 1 million people from the voter rolls in Georgia between 2012 and 2016, and put the registrations of 53,000 people, 80% of whom were voters of color, on hold before the election. Over 200 polling places were closed in 6 years, and on election day, there were 4-hour lines in heavily Black precincts in Georgia. And all of this helped Secretary Kemp win his election. And then months later, not even 6 months later, he signed into law a measure prohibiting abortions after 6 weeks of pregnancy. So essentially, folks' voices are being stymied at the polls. They're not able to cast votes for the candidates who represent their values. And so the candidates who don't represent their values are being elected, and they're showing with their policies and politics that they do not care about the folks that are representative of their districts or their states, whatever the case may be. So Georgians overall oppose the new anti-abortion law that was passed by Governor Kemp, 49% to 44%. So it's a close margin, but the majority of folks polled do not support this law. But the bill easily passed in the state legislature, which has become increasingly gerrymandered. Black voters are in just a few districts, and so the state legislature is not representative of the folks who are in the districts. And as was referenced before, Stacey Abrams stated it perfectly. She tweeted, "Bad policies like the forced pregnancy bill are a direct result of voter suppression." For the sake of time, I'm not going to lift up all of the other examples I have, but Alabama has a similar gerrymandering strategy to segregate Black voters. And, you know, we saw in 2017, Senator Doug Jones, win 50% of the vote. But he carried only one congressional district in that state. So that really shows just how lopsided the state's political map has become. And then the same year, a federal court ruled that 12 of Alabama's legislative districts were illegally, specifically racially gerrymandered. And as I said at the start of this presentation, Alabama now has the most restrictive anti-abortion ban in the US. And so it's really impossible to disconnect the gerrymandering and other voter suppression we see from the passage of these really heinous and horrendous abortion restrictions. So it starts at the polls. We elect officials who we hope are going to enact policies that benefit us. And when we're not able to make our voices and our values known at the polls, what we see is essentially policies that we don't support being enacted by legislators that we don't support. So there is a real intersection of these issues. So I'm going to end there. Happy to take questions, but these are some resources that I lifted up. A link to our organization. Guttmacher just has a ton of great resources and statistics and data around abortion access and abortion rights in this country. And then I wanted to lift up the National Network of Abortion Funds. Many of your states have local abortion funds that are really helpful in getting folks connected to the care that they need. And that includes support for transportation, childcare, so on and so forth. In Our Own Voice is really proud to be in the second year of our I Am a Voter campaign, which is really meant to empower Black women in particular to go to the polls and make their voices heard and to fight back against this type of voter suppression that we just discussed. But I think the resources are really valuable to anyone and everyone. We have great voter guides about the laws that exist in specific states that we do our work in. And then Rock the Vote has a ton of great resources around knowing your voting rights and ensuring that you're not being illegally turned away from the polls and that you have all of your documentation and whatnot in order. So I encourage folks to access those resources, and I think they're going to be shared around after. And here's my contact information. Again, happy to take questions, but also please feel free to reach out to me at any time. And I will turn it back to NCJW.
Thanks so much, Jessica. That was so helpful and informative. We're going to move to a Q&A. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat box. We will be sharing all the links that Jessica mentioned and that were on the last slide of the PowerPoint, as well as information from the League of Women Voters and Nonprofit Vote, who we had a webinar with earlier this month. So I think like a big question that we got in the registration for the webinar as well was how this works the other way. So how the criminalization of pregnant people through these restrictive state laws then leads to voter suppression.
That's a great question. I think the way that In Our Own Voice talks about this is just an overall issue around bodily autonomy, right? And so we all have the right to be able to go to the polls and make our, I've said it 9 million times now, our voices and our values heard. And we also have the right to be able to make decisions about if, when, and how we want to parent, free from government interference and without fear of being unsafe or criminalized for making decisions that impact our families. And so I think that is the connection that we would make on the reverse, is that it's really about having the autonomy to make decisions in all aspects of your life, whether it be who you elect to office or when and how and if you decide to start a family.
Yeah, and I also think that like some of the voter suppression tactics you're talking about, like stripping people from the voter rolls, you know, that definitely plays into it. If you're in a restrictive state that charges you with a felony for having an abortion or for providing an abortion, and then you're then stripped from the voter rolls, like you're being denied your civil rights on so many levels.
Absolutely.
So here's another question that came in from the registration. Does this issue impact young people in particular? And if so, how can they best advocate around voter suppression and restrictive abortion laws?
Yeah, I think this issue definitely impacts young folks as well. I mean, as it relates to being able to access abortion care, I shared some information just about the additional hurdles that young people may have to overcome to access that care. But as it relates to voting, I think a lot of the issues we see around voter suppression impact college students in particular. There's a lot of polls will not accept a college ID or university's ID as valid identification, and so students can't use their student ID to vote. And so, you know, I went to college in my home state, so I had a driver's license and a student ID, but if you go to college out of state and you're not driving, why would you necessarily have a state issued ID? Why would you think as a student who doesn't live full time in a specific state that you need to go and act and, you know, get yourself a state issued identification card? And then there are also the issues of having like a temporary residence on a college campus versus a permanent residence at home. If you're still using your permanent residence, there can be a lot of confusion around, you know, which address you're supposed to vote at and all of that. And so I definitely think this is something that impacts young folks. And I would just encourage young folks to really be clear on what laws exist in the state you're trying to vote in, and help inform your friends and peers. I think a lot of campuses have done really great get out the vote efforts, and so there's definitely resources on most college campuses through student services and things like that where you can access that information.
Great, thank you. That's so helpful. A lot of our people are involved in canvassing and getting people to register to vote. How can they talk about abortion if or when it comes up in a manner that is compliant with our C3 status?
Yeah, I always encourage folks who are doing any kind of get out the vote efforts that you can just remind people as you're registering them to vote or as you're sharing information about the election that their opinions and politics on any number of issues, including abortion, that one of the most influential places to make that those opinions known is at the poll. So we may not agree with how everyone votes once they get to the poll, but they have the right to express that opinion, particularly in that regard. And so if you care about healthcare as a whole, if you care about your bodily autonomy and ability to make those decisions for yourself, and not have the government interfere in that decision-making process, then you need to be registered to vote and you need to vote.
Exactly. So somebody from our Tennessee section was just at the hearing that they had about their proposed abortion ban. And they talked a little bit about their experience, and they were wondering, how do we get people to understand that this is a real issue that we need to fight?
Yeah. Well, shout out to whoever was there. Our partner organization, Sister Reach, was present, and their executive director, Cherise Scott, was the one who some folks may have seen be pulled out of the hearing and essentially had her mic turned off and everything. And so I know that she's fighting very hard in Tennessee to make it clear that this is an issue. And I think to the point that was raised in the question, it's really hard when your mic's turned off. I think you have to have these conversations in a lot of different avenues. A lot of the work that In Our Own Voice does and our state partners do is to try and reach people in non-traditional settings to have these conversations. And so Cherise in Tennessee does a lot of work in the faith-based community. She herself is ordained, and we do have data that shows that many folks of faith are also pro-choice and believe in folks having access to abortion care. And so I think it's really being creative about where and how we have those conversations. I think that question also mentioned, I saw in reading it in advance, that there were a lot of men present at the hearing. I think that's a very interesting conversation that we as a movement have been having as to whether it's helpful to have men in this space. I think it's important as long as we're not stigmatizing women in the process, right? So, or folks accessing abortion care, period. You should care about these issues whether you have a mother or a sister or whatever the case may be. And so I think it's helpful to have folks who don't require abortion care be part of the conversation when they can. And I think there's a thoughtful way to do that ensures that they're not taking up too much space, but really being an ally and supportive. But I think it's another component is really the storytelling aspect, to the extent that folks feel comfortable. I think National Network of Abortion Funds has a t-shirt that folks really love to wear that says, "Everybody loves somebody who's had an abortion." And I've been wearing it on the street in DC, and people have stopped me and said, "I don't think that's true." And I don't know that I don't think that people realize how many people in their lives have had abortions, and that, the more we learn about each other, the more these stories come out. And I think the same goes for voter suppression. It can be really embarrassing to go to the polls and be turned away, but I think we have to make our voices heard, and we have to share our stories with people, because sometimes people are like, "Oh, I waited in a 4-hour line. It was just another day at the poll." But like, no one should be waiting in a 4-hour line to vote. It's our civic duty. It's our right. And it shouldn't take half of our day to do it. And so I think there's some destigmatization work, both in abortion rights and voting rights, to ensure that folks understand the full rights that we have as individuals and what true bodily autonomy looks like.
Yeah, you're taking the words right out of my mind. So there was also a question about the use of language like folks rather than women when referring to people who are seeking abortion. Can you just explain a little bit about why we prefer to use terms like patients or pregnant people?
Yeah, and different folks have different, different people have different preferences. I know some people who really don't like to say patients because not all folks think about themselves as patients. Like, if you're going to access abortion care, you're just a person going to access abortion care. You don't necessarily think about yourself as a patient. And so when we're doing advocacy work, sometimes patient doesn't resonate with folks. I say folks a lot because I personally know people who don't identify as women who have required abortion care. I think it's important to ensure that those people are also lifted up in the conversation, because if you are trans, non-binary, so on and so forth, and are trying to access abortion care, you face even more hurdles, oftentimes than cis women who are trying to access that care. And so I think it's a little bit of a work in progress. I know I have a lot of conversations with legislators when we're working on bills and talking points where people just instinctively go to women. But there are many a person who does not identify as a woman who could require abortion care. And I think it is important to keep them centered and front of mind to the extent that we can.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely agree. And I think that like changing the way we speak about abortion access, it more accurately reflects like everyone who we're talking about.
Yeah.
So I think that it's so important.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Did you have any other questions that you saw?
Yeah, so one question, and we've really had so many questions throughout, and we are running out of time. So I think this will have to be the last question. And it was essentially, what can we do to take action on voter suppression, perhaps in particular gerrymandering? So that's another question I'll throw out there, and we can also help answer too.
Yeah, I think a big piece is being informed. We are way more likely to not be turned away at the polls if we have kind of checked all of our boxes. We shouldn't have to. I think, Election Day should be a national holiday that we all are off, and it's easy to go and vote. There's some great legislation that the House has passed in H.R. 1 that would make the election day a national holiday. Sorry, drew a blank for a second. And would help with some of the other gerrymandering and voter suppression issues that we see arising around voter ID laws and things like that. So we would love to see the Senate host a hearing or vote on that. And so I think to the extent that you can encourage your senators to take up that legislation, that would be huge. We're also seeing a lot of work be done to restore the Voting Rights Act. So encouraging your congressional members to to address the Voting Rights Act, and passing that legislation in the House and the Senate would be really helpful for these efforts. And then I think it's really just making sure we're informed and helping others get informed. I think that Shannon is going to share some resources out afterwards around, places to get information about what voter laws exist in your state and what resources are reliable to share with others in your communities.
Great.
I might just add only one thing to that, or maybe two things to that beautiful answer. I think the first is one other avenue in different states. Some states already have this. Michigan, for example, last election started working on this, but independent redistricting commissions. It's a way to take gerrymandering out of the ruling party of whichever political party, right? And just make it fair. And the other thing I'll say is, Shannon will be putting together all these resources and sending them out. And in the slides are some of the groups that are part of In Our Own Voice, like the state partners, and also just other groups that In Our Own Voice works with. These could be great people in that state in particular to reach out to and say, how can I help you with your voter registration, your get out the vote work? And maybe these are some amazing partnerships that we can bring together. NCJW leaders who've been doing this for a really long time in their communities, kind of working with groups that are perhaps whose work is just as old as NCJW, perhaps their work is newer, and a real meeting of the minds. I think that could be really powerful.
Yeah.
And I'll just stop there.
Great. So that ends our Q&A session. I'm going to turn it over to Lauren to close us out, but thank you so much, Jessica.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me now? Sorry. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Garfunkel, NCJW Board Director and co-chair of our Reproductive Health, Rights, and Justice Initiative. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar and for your very thoughtful questions. I want to express gratitude to In Our Own Voice and to Jessica specifically for her help in planning and making this webinar happen. We truly value your partnership, speaking of partnerships, and are proud to work alongside you to lift up the intersection of abortion and other critical issues. After having learned so much about abortion and voter suppression, I urge you all to get involved and to use this information in your advocacy work. In addition to NCJW's voter engagement and reproductive health, rights, and justice action resources, you can use the resources from Let America Vote, the League of Women Voters, and nonprofit Vote that Jessica mentioned. Keep an eye out for an email from NCJW with these helpful links, a recording of this webinar, and a short evaluation. Your feedback informs future programming, so please take a moment to fill it out. It's really important. Also, please let us know if we can assist you in your reproductive health, rights, and justice and voter engagement work. Finally, be sure to join us for the third part of our Lead Summer Abortion And series on September 18th, late summer, at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. This special webinar will focus on abortion and the Supreme Court. It's a hot topic these days. If you have any additional questions, please contact Ari Conrad at aconrad@ncjw.org or Shannon Russell at srussell@ncjw.org. Thanks again for joining us, and a huge thanks to Jessica and In Our Own Voice. Have a great day.